Welcome to the Play-Based Learning Podcast. I'm your host, Kristen R.B. Peterson, and maybe your new teacher bestie that is here to hype you up, maybe give you a motivating kick in the pants, and teach you all I know about play and childhood. I am here to help you challenge old and outdated practices and inspire you to create a truly developmentally appropriate early childhood environment that fosters creativity, curiosity, and joy in the children that you care for. Let's set the stage for a lifelong love of learning. Let's get going. Jess Teixeira is joining me today for the podcast, and we're talking about a topic that I actually had no idea what it even meant 6 weeks ago, and she schooled me on this topic, and I was so intrigued with the information that she let out into the world that I was like, you need to be on the podcast. So, Jess, welcome. Tell us a little bit about you, and then tell us what we're going to be talking about.
Hello. I'm honored to be here. I love this podcast. I've been following you for years. So,
Aw, you're sweet.
a little about me. I am a speech language pathologist. I'm based out in Boston. I'm a private practice owner. I specialize in supporting neurodivergent children and their families and mainly supporting Gestalt language processors. So that's kind of what I do. And I also run an educational Instagram where I post a lot about Gestalt language processing, neurodivergent, neurodiversity affirming practices, and all those kinds of things. So
amazing. Okay, so I didn't even know how to pronounce the word Gestalt like a while back, but now I do. And the interesting thing is once you learn something, you see it everywhere. So of course, it's been coming all across my Instagram, and I'm seeing that word everywhere now. And the word is spelled Gestalt, correct?
got it.
Gestalt Language Processors.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us, what does that mean? What does Gestalt Language Processing mean?
Okay, so it's helpful to think of language processing as a continuum. So one end of the continuum is analytic language processing. The other end is Gestalt language processing. Some children are fully analytic. Some children are fully Gestalt. Some children fall in between, but a lot of children are one or the other. And so it's helpful for me to start with explaining what analytic language processing is, because this is what everyone is most familiar with.
Okay.
It's what everybody thinks of as the norm. And then I can get into Gestalt language processing, and then you can see how it differs. So this is going to sound very familiar. So analytic language processors, they start with single words. So they are referred to as word babies. And so their first stage is single words, and then eventually they start moving into two-word combinations, and then eventually three-word phrases, longer phrases, sentences with beginning grammar, and then eventually they're having adult-like conversations. Mm-hmm. This is what we all mostly know as quote-unquote normal language development. Okay. So the whole time, and I always say this whenever I talk about Gestalt language processing, the whole time analytic language processors, their language is flexible.
Okay.
So with Gestalt language processors, they are intonation babies. So analytic language processors are word babies. Gestalt language processors are intonation babies. So they start with chunks of language, and they pick these up based on the intonational contour of that chunk of language and the experience of when they heard it. And they pick this language up verbatim, and they use these chunks of language to communicate. And these chunks can be any length. They can be single words, sentences, whole movies, whole books. And these are called Gestalts. And that is that first stage of Gestalt language development. But the thing is, these Gestalts are not flexible. So that means that they can't be expanded on. They can't be combined into longer utterances. And they're often referred to as scripting or echolalia, so that might be something that sounds more familiar to listeners, but they're more accurately Gestalts because they really are much more than scripting.
Okay, so give us an example of intonation. Is that what you called it?
A Gestalt.
A Gestalt.
Okay. That word, yes.
Okay.
So a stage 1 Gestalt. So for example, I have a client who says jumping up and down in muddy puddles. This is a line from Peppa Pig.
Okay.
And so they heard the jumping up and down in muddy puddles from their favorite show, and they picked up this chunk verbatim, and every time they say it, they have that intonation. I won't sing it. I'll bear you guys from having to listen to me sing, but it's often in the shows, and that to them is them communicating that they want to go outside. So
Okay.
they're often outside in the show, jumping up and down in muddy puddles. And so this child says jumping up and down in muddy puddles to communicate that they want to go outside because they saw it on the episode. They saw that Peppa was outside with whoever she was outside with and said, oh, I could use that. And that sounds really cool because I love intonation. I'm going to pick that up as a whole chunk and use that to communicate that I want to go outside. So that's just that first stage for Gestalt language processors. So they follow predictable stages just like analytic language processors do. So eventually they move into the second stage where they start to mitigate or break down those whole chunks into partial gestalts
Mm-hmm.
and match them into these semi-unique utterances. Eventually, then they go into that next stage, which is stage 3, where they're isolating single words from their previous gestalts. So
Okay.
previous chunks. And these single words are finally flexible. So this stage is basically where analytic language processors start.
Okay.
So they get there, that journey there just looks a little different. And so once they're in that third stage where they're isolating single words, they can start to combine them based off
Mm-hmm.
of semantic relationships, and then they put them into phrases and sentences with beginning grammar, more advanced grammar, and then again, like adult-like sentences. So again, it's that same ending point of that
Yes.
self-generated, flexible, adult-like language. It just looks different.
Absolutely. Okay. So now, as like an early childhood educator or an educator in a classroom, because I mean, this is really like an early childhood thing when language is developing for the most part, correct? Um, how can we identify Gestalt language processors? What are some
Yes.
like, so we know that it's, they have these phrases, but like, how do we like figure out, is it word baby or did you say intonation baby?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How
Yeah.
do we know where they are and like what's what? And how, and then I guess the second part of that question is then how do we seek out support and do we even need to seek out support?
Sure. No, those are all great questions. So the first thing to note here is that anybody can be a Gestalt language processor, but many Gestalt language processors are neurodivergent or more specifically autistic. So most autistic children are Gestalt language processors. So
Okay.
that's the first thing to think of when debating, could they be a Gestalt language processor?
Okay.
And then there's other signs to look for too. And we can identify a child as a Gestalt language Gestalt language processor, whether they are speaking, non-speaking, or minimally speaking. So that's like the number one question I get is, well, my child isn't speaking, so how am I supposed to know if they're a
Yeah.
Gestalt processor? So first, let's talk about speaking Gestalt language processors and then non-speaking or minimally speaking. So
Okay.
speaking Gestalt language processors, these children have, again, very rich intonation. So this is going to be like across the board, something that you're seeing, because remember, they're intonation babies. They pick up language because of the intonation, because of the emotion. And when they use those gestalts, they often use the intonation,
Mm-hmm.
the original source. So
Okay.
if you have a child who has a lot of intonation, that's a sign that they might be a GLP. Another one is if they're using long gestalts. So these are the most obvious Gestalt language processors. So these are the ones that are using lines from TV shows, from communication partners, and it's very clearly from something else, right? Because
Yeah.
of intonation, because you know that child and you know that they love Bluey and you know that's a line from Bluey, for example,
Yeah.
or from Peppa Pig, because I always give examples from Peppa Pig. Like if they're talking in a British accent and you hear them saying jumping up and down in muddy puddles, right? So these kids are the most obvious because
Yeah.
like, oh, okay, that's a line from this show or this movie, or I
Yeah.
know that person says that. So that's the most obvious. And then another one, and this one's a little trickier. So this one is a child that has many single words.
Mm.
Okay. I'm not talking about a child that has like ball, dog, small, right? All these single words. These are single words that seemingly quote unquote go nowhere.
Okay.
So these children might have hundreds of single words, but, and remember, like going back to what I said earlier, they're not flexible. So these single words are single word gestalts and they can't build on them. So these are the children who come to you and their parents say, well, they have hundreds of words, but they're just not combining them. They're not taking dog and small and saying small dog. So there's these unflexible single words that often hold a much larger meaning because they are gestalt. So they hold that experience with them. So dog might be a single word that they have, but dog might be also used to communicate more than just a dog. It might
Yeah.
be, I hear a dog, my neighbor walked by and they don't have their dog, right? So it's communicating often much more than just a dog, that animal,
Yeah.
right? Another sign is if they have long strings of unintelligible language, but with a lot of that intonation.
Okay.
And this is really helpful for early educators because this often happens because the child is really young. So like 2, 3, right? Those preschool ages. And they're picking up really long gestalts or these really long phrases. And no kid that young can say a phrase that long intelligibly, right? They're not often intelligible when they're saying things that long. That is not just solely Gestalt language processors, that's most children that age, right? But with Gestalt language processors, there's this added thing, which is they're tuning into intonation. So when they're picking up whole phrases, they're tuning into that intonation rather than each individual word and how that word is produced. So they're not concerned with producing it correctly in the early stages. It seems like they have articulation or speech sound errors or disorder, right? But as they move through the stages and they start tuning into those single words, all of a sudden they start sounding more intelligible. You can understand them more. And they never really had a speech sound disorder, right? Because they were just tuning into that intonation.
Oh.
So, yeah. And then another one is that they're whole to part thinkers or Gestalt cognitive processors.
Okay.
So that means that they have this hyper awareness of all the details within the events that happen in their life. So they're picking up whole routines, they have wonderful episodic memories, and they remember all those details within the entirety of an event. And it's a whole for them. So just like their language is a whole, those events are a whole. And so if something within that whole changes, it can be really distressing. So for example, if they're missing a piece from a set of a toy set, or there's a change in a typical routine, they might be distressed by that. So that's another clue that they might be a Gestalt thinker and also a Gestalt language processor. So so that's for children that are speaking. So for children that are non-speaking or minimal speaking, some clues that they could be a GLP, and this is one I hear very, very often with my clients, is that they sing or hum before speaking.
Oh.
Because, right, they love intonation, so they're very musical. So they're picking up often on songs before they're picking up language and using language. And so Gestalt language processors are very musical and they often have perfect pitch. So,
What?
oh yeah,
Wow.
I know. So if you have a child that is in your class or that is a client or is your own child that gets very distressed when you sing, it might be because, sorry to break it to
you
you,
suck and you're not on pitch.
you don't have perfect pitch. And I'll be honest, I don't. I don't have perfect pitch, and many of my clients don't let me sing because, yeah, because they have perfect pitch, and it is very distressing to hear me sing. They love music. It's very
Wow.
musical. Yeah, so that's a clue that they could be a Gestalt language processor. Another sign is if they have access to media or like an iPad or YouTube or something in any way, and they often rewatch the same media clips repeatedly or even act out those clips. This is called echopraxia. They might be a Gestalt language processor.
Okay.
If they're an AAC user, so someone who uses augmentative and alternative communication, so like a communication app on an iPad,
Yeah.
and they are very stuck with their iPad, they're stuck on single words, they haven't really progressed despite like intensive intervention, intensive
Yeah.
modeling, clue that they're a Gestalt language processor because AAC apps are not set up for Gestalt language processors.
Oh, interesting.
Yes, so those are some of those clues. And then some of the things that I mentioned before, like that hold apart thinking, that like long strings of unintelligible language where it like sounds like they're saying something, but you
Mhm.
don't know what they're saying. Um,
Wow. I'm actually like, as you're speaking, I'm thinking back to one little guy that I had in my class, and I remember that he could repeat a whole entire book
yeah,
front to back, and he wouldn't stop until it was done.
yep,
Like he would not. And then now that I think of it, he hummed a lot. And I remember that he would sometimes, like, I would try if he was singing and I knew the song, like if I went to sing along with him, he would put his hand over my mouth,
yep.
like, don't sing anymore.
Yeah, I have parents all the time that sometimes I just start singing, I forget because I love to sing, even though
Mhm.
I'm not a great singer. It's just like something that I like just naturally do without thinking. And I'll have clients be like, no, 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 and like do what you just said, like put their hand up, and parents will be like, oh my gosh, I'm sorry. And I'm like, no, it's okay. I shouldn't have done it. Like, I know
Yeah.
I don't sound great. But yeah, yeah.
Oh, wow.
And then to answer your question too on like how do we know if they need support?
Yeah.
So not all Gestalt language processors do need support.
Yeah.
So just like analytic language processors can be delayed in their language development, so can Gestalt language processors. So
Mhm.
if they are past the age of like 2.5 or 3 and they're still mainly using delayed echolalia or those gestalts to communicate, they
Yes.
likely need support from someone who's knowledgeable in Gestalt language processing.
Okay.
That's a huge clue. Or if they just are having trouble being understood, it's clear there's a lot of frustration, then they might need support. Those are just some reasons why they might. But yeah,
Absolutely. Okay, so coming from me, former early childhood educator, to you, a speech language pathologist, how can parents, SLPs, and educators all work together to help to provide support for these kiddos?
absolutely. So collaboration is something that I honestly I love talking about because I always say that I understand that it can be hard, especially for something that so many people don't know about.
Yeah.
My biggest I usually say there's 4 things that I focus on when it comes to collaboration and like educating others and trying to get on the same page. And the first is always to just meet people where they're at.
Mhm.
Like we all are at different places in learning about Gestalt language processing. We're all at different places in learning about neurodiversity affirming practices. And I say neurodiversity affirming practices because, again, a lot of Gestalt language processors are neurodivergent.
Mm.
And a lot of the strategies that we use to support them, or all of them, should be neurodiversity affirming.
Mhm.
And understanding that, like, some people aren't there yet. They don't have the bandwidth to like fully jump on board and just get all of this information. Like, as much as I love educating on this, if I came to someone and I said, here is all this information, like, here are all these handouts, here's where you can go. Like, some people just aren't there yet. So figuring out where they're at and how much they can or they're open to or how much they can change, that is like my number one thing always, always, always. And then if they are willing to learn, start small, like start with just the definitions, right? Like if we're in a
Yeah,
college course, we're not going to jump to the end. We're going to start with the basics. So I
absolutely.
always say, like, whether you're a parent or professional, start there. The next thing I always say is to just relate to people and respect where they're at. Like, I was there, and I tell people this always too. Like, there was a time where I didn't understand Gestalt language processing. I
Mhm.
thought that Gestalts were not meaningful. I was told to ignore them. I was told to extinguish them, to tell kids, don't, no movie talk, don't
Mm.
do that. Yeah.
Aw.
And but I was there at one point, and some people just don't know, and you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah,
Right.
you don't.
And I'm never here to shame anybody and say, well, what you're doing is not right, right? Because when you know better, you do better.
Absolutely.
So that's always my second thing. My third thing is, if you are knowledgeable about Gestalt language processing, invite people in or share videos. If you're a
Mhm.
parent, share videos of you using these strategies at home to support your child. Or you're a teacher or a therapist, invite people into your sessions and show them. Like, it's undeniable when you see it with your own eyes that this stuff actually works. These children are
Yeah.
making progress. And then the last one I always say is, like, support what you're saying. Like, the research is there, right? Like, it exists. There are adult Gestalt language processors that are sharing their experiences as well. Share those resources. I share a lot of them on my page.
Mhm.
And, if someone is giving you some pushback, say, here you go. This stuff exists. Here's the research. Here's
Absolutely.
the resources. Yeah.
Okay. What are some challenges that families that have Gestalt language processors face?
So the challenges, I would say, is definitely the pushback, like we were just talking about. That's probably the number one thing that I hear from families is, like, why don't people know about this? Like,
Mm.
why doesn't their teacher, why doesn't their SLP, why doesn't so and so know about Gestalt language processing? And how can I educate them? So I always
Yeah.
go back to those four things of, like, meeting people where they're at, right? What I just said, respecting and relating, inviting them in, supporting, all those things. It's definitely the pushback. Another challenge is the fact that curriculums in schools often aren't set up for Gestalt language processors. That is a huge one, okay?
Or
Because
for any is like it's for any neurodivergent
oh,
person.
exactly. Like, they are just, the curriculum is not set up for them. And so, for example, like reading comprehension is WH questions, right? Who, what, where, when, all these things. Gestalt language processors, they cannot reliably answer WH questions until they're in the later stages of their language development. Okay, so they're in the early stages, they're using language verbatim that they've heard. So if someone asks them a question, they're using language often that's as close as they can to that answer, which some people might not recognize what that
Mhm.
means, or they're just not going to respond because they know that they don't have the language to respond to that question. They can't reliably answer that yet. That doesn't mean
Yeah.
that they don't know the answer. Their language expressively is just not there yet.
Yeah.
So this is such a huge thing in schools, and some kids just developmentally, language-wise, aren't there,
Yeah.
right? And then another thing is, like, literacy. A lot of Gestalt language processors, they some are hyperlexic, so they right? So that's one thing to think about. Some respond better to, like, a whole word approach because
Okay.
that's how they develop language, but schools aren't really doing that anymore, right? So
Yeah.
and then some Gestalt language processors, they just don't catch on to reading until they're self-generating language and they're isolating single words. Right. So, like,
Okay.
those are just some examples of, like, challenges that families face. But I mean, there are so many, so many. Like, one more is the fact that a lot of this, just school systems in general are largely compliance based. And these
Mhm.
children are best supported through focusing on connection and naturalistic language modeling. Like,
Yeah.
Gestalts are picked up because that language is meaningful to them. And so if we're focusing on anything other than connection and natural language interactions, then that just doesn't work for these children.
Interesting. So the last podcast interview that I did was with Stacey Binge, and she wrote The Whole Child Alphabet.
Mhm.
So I just talked with her last episode about how children develop like phonemic awareness and just like alphabet knowledge. What does that look like for Gestalt language processors? Like to learn the sounds the letters make and then to like string it all together.
Well, for that, some just have a special or preferred interest in letters, right? So a
Okay.
lot of children, especially if they're hyperlexic,
What
they're
does
going.
hyperlexic mean?
So those are children that are precocious readers, so very early readers with
Okay.
being taught. So no,
Okay.
right? So those are those children that are learning to read at like 2 years old, 3 years old, and their parents are like,
What is going on here?
"What is going on? I never taught
This,
them how to read."
this is the little boy that I would put his hand over my mouth. Same thing. He taught himself how to read.
Exactly. And so these children often have a special or preferred interest in letters and numbers. So
Mm,
also hypernumeracy, right? So all these things. And so they might take to alphabet and in letter sounds because of that special interest.
okay.
Whereas others just might not pick up on an approach like that until they're later on in their language development. Literacy is so individualized for Gestalt language processors. I always wish there was just one blanket answer I could
Yeah,
give that
wouldn't that be
would
so
say
nice?
always, right? Always. But there's just not. Like I said, some kids just take to a whole word approach. Some kids take to letter sounds in a phonemic approach because it might be that they have that interest in letters and they just take to it. And some kids just don't take to reading
Yeah.
until later on in their language development. And that's often what we see. And then we have those hyperlexic kids that are just reading without being taught. So there's
Yeah.
really such a range when it comes to literacy and just figuring out like what works for that individual child instead of just taking like a blanket approach to
Right.
in general, which is often what we see in schools. So it's such a challenge.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Have you found that children that are Gestalt language processors, like, do their parents or at-home caregivers, guardians come seeking help because there's a lot of like behavior issues because of the way that they're processing language?
Yes and no. I think
Okay.
for some kids, I mean, for so many Gestalt language processors, they're just frustrated in general because people don't understand the way
Yeah.
that they're processing language. So, like I said earlier, a lot of people are ignoring their communication because they
Yeah.
don't think it's meaningful, right? They don't have those foundational things like connection and regulation because of the way that people or these biases or these ideas that people have about children who do process language this way. And so when they're having difficulty communicating and then people aren't acknowledging their communication or treating it as if it's not meaningful, then they communicate through behavior, right?
Yeah.
Behavior communication. So
Hmm.
yeah, a lot of these kids, unless their parents are coming in with, already knowing about Gestalt language processing, just coming in with, trying to get a little more support and they're already being supported appropriately at home and these parents have educated the professionals in their life, then oftentimes it's just other things that they're looking for support on. But there are, like you said, a lot of children that are coming in with parents saying, what is going on? Or why are they so dysregulated when their routine changes? Or why aren't they playing a certain way? And why aren't they, why are they so dysregulated when someone takes a toy out of their set, right? And so then it goes to educating about Gestalt cognitive processing and whole apart thinking and that their language is meaningful and that we need to acknowledge it as such.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So as a teacher, early childhood teacher, if you are now like thinking, oh, I might have a Gestalt language processor in my care, how do you approach their parents slash guardians about that? Because it's so hard as an early child educator to say, hey, like we might need to look into this further. Like, what
Totally.
would you suggest?
I think the biggest thing is starting with the fact that Gestalt language development is normal, natural language development. And so parents don't know, so they might at first have a big reaction because they might hear it and say, oh, that's different. I don't know what that is, right? But just
Yeah.
assuring them that this is normal, natural language development and that some children are just stuck or delayed, just like analytic language processors can be.
Yeah.
That there are ways to support their child. It just looks different
Yeah.
than it does for analytic language processing, and being open to collaborating with them on it.
Yeah.
And like I said earlier, meeting them where they're at. If they do have a big reaction, maybe we don't give them a stack of handouts and a
Yeah.
million things to look at because they just need to process that information. But that's typically where I start with families, where I say, hey, I always start with just the question, hey, have you heard of Gestalt language processing?
Okay.
The answer might be no. For parents, it often is. I
Yeah.
say, oh, okay, so there's this other way that children can develop language. And it seems like your child might develop language this way. Like, let's look at what that looks like. And I, show them a comparison of what that might look like, and that there
Mhm.
is these predictable steps that they go through. It's not this big unknown. There are ways to support them through this, and this is how we do it.
Yeah. Okay. So like I'm thinking, okay, what if then, so say you pose that and say, have you heard of this? And there's different ways that children can learn to process language. And you tell them Gestalt language processing, and then they go home and they Google it, and then they see maybe the word autism pop up all over the place in their Googled research. And then they start to spiral.
Yep.
How do you, so like, how it's such a touchy thing because it's like, how do you let them know about this without them like being angry at you for you suggesting that maybe their child has autism? Because that's where, those parents who are in that like survival mode, they're in like they have a stress response that's really quick. And so, you don't want them attacking you as the teacher for bringing it up either.
Absolutely. And that is often what happens when you Google it, that those are the things that come up.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean to like be a head horse saying this, but or it's really understanding where that response is coming from, going back to the fact that Gestalt language processing doesn't mean that their
Yeah.
child has autism. It doesn't mean their child is autistic. It could, it could be. And in that case, I think it's going back and saying, okay, like let's go back and let's just support them where they're at. Like
Yeah.
let's back and start supporting them in learning about neurodiversity affirming practices and giving them resources from autistic adults that are speaking out. And, I think that's where it has to start. Like maybe they're not ready then to jump into Gestalt language processing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Maybe we need to go back and show them that, and trust me, I understand that so many people have these, biases about autism, and, people just aren't there yet in their journey about neurodiversity and all the things. So sometimes it's just going back and supporting them and educating them about that, if that is the case. And if it isn't, right, assuring them that just because their child is a Gestalt language processor doesn't necessarily mean that they are autistic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think, when I was in the classroom teaching, we never would bring up any sort of word that would have like a label or a diagnosis attached to it, because we are not professionals in those areas to be able to give a child a diagnosis. So I think if I were still running a school and if I ran across a kiddo that, was struggling a bit, and I think that they could use some extra support and that like maybe they were a Gestalt language processor, I would say, hey, I know that there's a couple different ways that children process language. And I'm noticing that we're just having some issues with communication. Communication can just be a little bit hard sometimes because of maybe the way that they're processing language. I don't even know if I would bring up the word Gestalt just because I am not a trained SLP and I wouldn't want them to go home and Google it.
Mhm.
I think I would just kind of like blanket it and be like, hey, I would love to connect you with an SLP who can maybe explain more, um, because I think that maybe there's some strategies that they could help so that your child we don't have this struggle and you won't have a struggle at home with your child over certain things. So I think that's what I would do in my program just because I wouldn't want anybody coming back and saying, "You labeled them as this, but that's not the case." Or, we went to the speech and language pathologist and they said that that's not how my child is processing language. And then so you're like opening up this whole entire can of worms as a educator in a classroom if you throw any sort of a term out there. And I think that's how I would handle it. I don't know. Do you think that that's a good approach or not?
I think it depends. I think if they might go home and Google it, right? But I think just trying to assure them that like this isn't a diagnosis, this is simply a way to show how your child processes language and make
Yeah.
sure that we support them in the best way.
Yeah.
And in that way, like we're not putting a label on them. We are saying
Yeah.
like this does not mean that they have any kind of label. This is just a way of describing typical language development. It's unfortunate that so many people don't know about it, but like
Mm,
hopefully through things like this, more people will learn about it.
absolutely.
And
Yes.
and if you feel like that may be their response, then I always say that it's just little shifts in what we're already doing to support these children. And if that's the case, like maybe just going to parents and letting them know, like, hey, instead of asking so many questions, why don't we use declarative language? And if that child is a Gestalt language processor, they're going to benefit from that because they're getting whole phrase models rather than questions.
Can you
And
give us an example of declarative language?
absolutely. So let's say your child is playing and they're holding a toy and you're saying, so they're holding a toy and you say, what's that?
Mm,
Right? So that would be asking a question. So if you were using declarative language, you're just making an observation,
mm,
narrating and commenting. So you, instead of saying, what's that? You might say, ooh, it's a superhero,
mm.
right? You are just narrating and commenting on what
Okay.
your child is doing rather than asking questions.
Okay.
And
I call
so
it sports casting.
exactly.
Yeah.
So that's just one little shift that a classroom teacher could make, the speech language pathologist can make, a parent can make, and any child can benefit from that, right?
Absolutely.
So
Yes.
even if we don't go in and say your child is this, your child is this, or anything like, hey, here's this little shift. I noticed that your child's having difficulty communicating. Why don't we all try using sportscasting
Mhm.
or using declarative language and see how they respond. And if they're a Gestalt language processor, they're likely going to respond to it well. And if they're an analytic language processor, they will too, because they'll take what they need.
Yeah.
So it's little shifts like that, like reducing questions, focusing on connection and acknowledging
Mhm.
all their communication, right? Like those are the the things that we're doing to support Gestalt language processors that support children no matter what,
Yeah. Mm.
right?
Such good information. All right. Where can people find more of Jess Teixeira and all of the amazing wisdom that you have?
So you can find me on Instagram at Jess the SLP. You can find my private practice. My private practice name is Playhaven Pediatric Therapy. So you can find me at www.playhavenpediatrics.com.
Amazing. Wonderful. Ah, Such a good conversation, but the time has come where we got to say goodbye. So thank you so much for being here and sharing your knowledge with everyone. You really opened my eyes to just a new way of thinking. And I wish I would have had this information when I was in the classroom because I think it could have been super helpful. So I'm hoping that people will get a lot out of it. I know they will. So thanks for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Mhm. If you liked what you heard today, share this podcast with your coworkers, admin, or maybe even your partner. And I love getting 5-star reviews so more people can embrace play. Hit follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode. Or connect with me on Instagram or my website, KristenRBPeterson.com. Until next time.